Harry, thank you so much for joining me on Misunderstood today from the UK, right?
Absolutely. Just outside of
Wow.
London. Yeah.
Wow. Well, thank you. I really appreciate you being here. I found you, I guess, just from going through Instagram, and somehow your page came up on my For You or whatever. And I didn't know who you were. I didn't know your story. And all of a sudden, I found that I was in tears, totally not. I'm somebody who has not been through what you have been through, but you struck a chord in me. So the feelings have been similar. I started my podcast because I believe that people's story, that's the most important thing they have. It's what they own. It is what makes them unique. It is the only thing that can either keep you in silence and fear and shame, or it could be the one thing that sets you free. So when I heard you say those words, I was like, this is my guy. I need to hear a story. When I heard your story, it was so powerful. It made such an impact. And I think it's so important for people to understand what it is like, what it has been for you to break your silence, and how you are now on the path to helping other people do that in the world of trauma and sexual abuse, especially of the generational kind. So I want to get right into your story, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So you have a book that's come out, and it's called Breaking the Silence. I want to talk to you about your story, how you came about writing this book.
So Breaking the Silence came to me, we'll jump ahead quickly, when I was watching the Jeffrey Epstein documentary. Have you seen it?
I have, yeah.
Yeah. So it was a couple of episodes into it, and one of the survivors was like, I couldn't speak up. I was sort of being manipulated and being controlled by this man who was super powerful, and who am I? I'm nobody. And she's like, I couldn't break my silence. And as soon as she said those words, it was like the universe just spoke to me. You got to do a book. You just got to do it. Right.
Wow.
And now, if we backtrack, the reason why I wrote the book about breaking the silence and the message behind it was because I was sexually abused within my family, and it was by my step granddad.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't know how long it lasted for, probably a couple of years-ish, but I don't remember when it started. But I remember snippets of it happening. And then I remember, interestingly enough, I don't actually remember the last time it happened. This is a recollection for my stepmom. So I was being abused by my step-granddad, and my stepmom caught it happening. And then she went out of the room, and she called me into the kitchen, and she took me home, told my dad, and then my dad confronted me. Now, my dad was a Cockney geezer who controlled things, who approached things through quite a confrontational manner. So when he asked me about what happened, he did it in quite a confrontational way, and he made me sort of feel like I did something wrong. And then he said to me, right, you're not going to go out and speak to anyone about this. You don't want to tell your biological mother. You're not going to tell your friends at school. You're going to keep this to yourself. We don't want a black cloud over the family name. And that's what he said. And that silence lasted about 12 years.
So I want to quickly ask you about that moment when your stepmom brought you into the kitchen and was asking you about this. Did you feel shame at that moment? Did you feel like, oh my God, I've been found out? Were you nervous about what your step granddad might say? Did he know that he was found out? Like, what was going on in that moment?
I remember it was a mix of emotions, because I remember thinking that my dad was completely overreacting, because he said, you're never going around there again. And then I got pissed at him because, then my dad became the villain of the story, not my step granddad. But I do recall a few years later, he told me one evening that he had gone round there and confronted him. But he didn't share any other details other than that. But I remember a short while later, I told my mother, who at that point I used to go and see once a month. And I remember lying in bed, and she was very, very upset. I think I just told her at that point. And I remember saying to her, she was crying, but Mum, I enjoyed it. And I remember those words coming out of my mouth, like, Mum, I enjoyed it. Like, don't get so upset. And as I grew up and I started to reflect on the abuse that happened, those words that I said as a child really stuck with me, because that definitely brought the shame into my life. I was a kid that enjoyed being abused by his granddad. I can't tell anybody this,
Right. Wow. And then what was your relationship with your step granddad like after that, after you were pulled away?
I never saw him again, never spoke to him again. And about 2 years later, he died from a heart attack at work.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, it's so like powerful and upsetting what you went through. And I know this is hard for people to even be listening to, because if you've been through something like this obviously strikes a chord and it's something that brings up a lot of feelings. If it's something we haven't been through, it's terribly, I mean, it's just so upsetting to listen to, especially when it comes from somebody within the family. I mean, are there statistics that you're familiar with about how often this happens within families and people are not reporting it? Like how often does this happen?
Well, I know that I can't remember the specific statistic, but I know it's over 80% of kids who have gone through abuse are abused by someone that they know. And it's
Mm,
not, there's no specific, here's the thing, there's no specific statistics on intrafamilial abuse, because that is going to be extremely difficult to monitor,
yeah,
because out of all sexual abuses, none of them you don't really want to talk about, but you don't want to talk about being molested by your dad or
right.
something happening by your brother. That's the shit you don't want to talk about.
Mm,
So for them to actually bring out statistics that are near accurate on that is, I don't see happening, but I think we can confidently assume that the majority of all of this happens within the family, because kids grow up within families. And if
yeah,
they're not families, a very close family friend.
right. Talk about what that's like to live in silence all these years until you do decide to talk about it. For you in your experience, was it something that was always in the back of your head? Did it affect your relationship with whoever you chose to be sexual with later? Like how did that manifest in you after as you grew up?
I think growing up, for the most part, I put it to the back of my head.
Hmm.
I think it might have sort of warped my certain viewpoints on how I am meant to be, and masculinity and things of that nature. But it wasn't like an everyday thing front of mind. It was very much in the back of my mind. And it would only be when things pop up in the world, like my dad maybe saying something or watching a film, that would then bring it to the forefront.
Hmm.
So there's definitely that. But as I got older and I I move out of London, I change college, and I'm with all of these new people. And I remember saying to myself, right, I don't want to be the Perry Power who was in London, because the Perry Power that was in London was still a virgin, didn't have many friends. He really wanted to be social, but he didn't have the confidence, blah, 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 blah. Now, when he goes to this new college, he's going to create this new character. He's going to create the Perry Power 2.0.
Mm.
And he's going to be the guy who's like kind of like a Stifler from American Pie, right? And we're talking maybe 13 years ago now, probably.
Hmm.
And so I definitely think that there's a link from that to the abuse, because many years later, that's when Lewis Howes brings out his book, Mask of Masculinity. And when I saw about all the different masks that he references, that's what made me realize that it wasn't in my language, in my way, I created a character, but
Hmm.
in that sense, I created multiple different masks to wear in order to fit into these situations where I weren't reminded of being a boy that was abused.
Right.
Yeah.
Um, in your experience, what are some of the biggest challenges survivors face when trying to speak out about the trauma? Like why for someone like me, you would think, well, why don't you just tell someone? But obviously it's harder than that. Explain that.
Yeah, because put it this way, when you've gone through abuse, a lot of times it's when you was a kid growing up into teenage years, and then usually there's a cut off, and then you become an adult for whatever reason, you move away or whatever it is. And then you live in your own mental world about what happened. Nine times
Mhm.
out of 10, there's shame, there's fear, there's guilt. So you create your own worldview, which that is very much part of. And when it comes to telling someone else, one of your biggest fears is them mirroring back to you that world that you've got inside of here. And you don't want
Mm,
that. You're scared
right,
shitless about someone saying, are you sure it happened that way?
right.
Why did your dad do that to you? And they don't even want to open up that door. And my dad, big part of the story is that my dad died from a heart attack June 1st, 2017, and it just
Mm,
happened out of nowhere. But prior to that, he became an alcoholic and had high blood pressure and things of that nature. But
mhm,
after I broke my silence, 6 to 8 months after he passed away, I then find out from his sister that he was abused too, growing up by the same man that abused me. And that's what really started the whole purpose journey that I'm on, but also made me really realize with proof that you can live and die in silence. And many people out there are, because they don't want to step into the world of the unknown. And a lot of the survivors that's in my circle, the phrase that they use the most when it comes to speaking out is being afraid of being seen. And I think that's the best way to sort of wrap this all up under one sort of phrase.
Right. What was it like when you eventually told more people in your family about what happened? I mean, I know the story from reading some of what you've talked about, but about how you were not the only one.
Yeah. So I knew growing up that my cousin was also abused, because she would tell me snippets. And then when I broke my silence and then I watched the video, she then realized it happened more than just the one time. Then I find out from my auntie, my dad's sister, that it happened to my cousin, yes, but more than I thought. It happened to her, and it also happened to my dad. And that's when we realized that there was this sort of spider web of abuse going on within the family. But then also much later on, I then find out from my step-granddad's family, and they're all Irish, for the Irish side, that his daughters reached out to me to say that he abused all of his kids too.
Oh,
and
wow.
So, we had that whole, and I was living in fear when I brought my book out that his family might see my story and see the book, see the media and the publications, and then come out to get me and maybe try to sue me for defamation or whatever it's going to be. I was living in that fear, but then for them to come out and say, hey, me too, me too, me too, it was just further sort of like, when there's someone that's abused within a family, very rarely is it just the one person.
Right.